Peace be upon you, and welcome to the second day of our symposium on evaluating the Islamic experience in governance. This week we are talking about Al-Nahda movement in Tunisia. This is the third symposium, and it will be under the title "The Policies and Performance." After the session that we had yesterday, this morning we will have three speakers. The first one is Fatima Touni. She will speak about the influence of media on the performance of Al-Nahda movement. Ms. Fatima is the advisor to the head of the Al-Nahda movement chairman, and she is a researcher in Al-Manar from the Higher Institute for Research and Studies. She is a graduate from Institute of Tunisia for Politics, and she has a master's degree in management of the hospitals. She also teaches the information technology in the Higher Institute for Technology and Communication, and she works as a researcher in renewable energy and climate change in the Energy Authority. She has participated in a number of projects in the government in 2014 and advisor to the European Union on different projects about food security, energy, and other projects in the Middle East. She also participated in a number of academic and research projects in more than 18 countries in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and she has got to the award of the youth researchers from Al Jazeera network in 2014. The second speaker will be Mr. Ahmed Qalul, and he will speak about the internal and external influence on the performance of the Al-Nahda movement. He has a PhD from Al-Rabat movement in Morocco, Rabat University in Morocco, and he has a master's degree in Islamic Studies and Middle Eastern Studies from South University in London, and he is a PhD researcher in the same university. He has conducted a number of research in Arabic and English in the political thought and in other fields, and he conducted a number of conferences and symposia in the world. He is a lecturer in Islamic studies in the Academic University in London, and he was
مؤسسي تيار الإسلاميون التقدميون، وهو رئيس تحرير مجلة 15/21. تحمل رئاسة تحرير العديد من الصحف والمجلات التونسية، كما أنه نائب سابق لرئيس الرابطة التونسية للدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان. هو خبير في شؤون الحركات الإسلامية وفي قضايا المجتمع المدني والتحول الديمقراطي، وخبير معتمد لدى الشبكة العربية للمنظمات غير الحكومية للتنمية في لبنان. كاتب عديد الدراسات ومؤلف كتاب الإسلاميون التقدميون.
A number of studies and published them in the Al-Islamiyun al-Taqaddumiyun. After the three speakers, we will have two comments. The first comment by Mr. Al-Abeid Mrawah. Mr. Al-Abeid Mrawah from Sudan. He is graduated from Al Khartoum University, the education college, and he has a master's degree in communication. He worked after graduation as a secretary of editorial secretary for Araya newspaper. Then he worked in the media office of the Prime Minister, then the correspondent for a number of newspapers and the National Council of Journalism. He was responsible for a number of websites between 2000 and 2011, including the National Institution for Publications, and he was also the head of the political programs in Sudan TV. Then he was ambassador to in 2011, and he was the head of the media office of the foreign minister. Then he was an ambassador of Sudan to Tunisia. That was between 2015 and 2018. He has a number of articles about the political issues in Sudan. Afterwards, we will have another comment by Dr. Isam Abd Shafi. Dr. Isam is the head of the International Relations Academy in Turkey, and he is the head of the Egyptian Center for Strategic and Political Studies. He has a PhD in Political Studies and International Relations from Cairo University, and in the political economy, as well as a master's degree. And before that, he was a visiting researcher in the Al Jazeera Research Center and another research in Doha, Qatar. He was a professor in a number of universities, including Alexandria, Damanhur, and 6th of October in Cairo, and Sakarya University in Turkey. And he was a fellow lecturer in the political sciences in Cairo University. Welcome all, and this is one of the sessions that we are waiting it very patiently, because we have a lot of topics that are uh, very important for the audience. We will start with Miss Fatima. You have 25 minutes, please. The floor is
شكرا
yours.
لك دكتور. تحية طيبة للجميع. سيد رئيس الجلسة، السادة الحضور
Thank you very
المتابعون.
much, Chairman of this session, and I would like to greet all the attendees from Tunisia.
يعني شكرا لدعوتي السيد
Thank you
رئيس
for
الجلسة
inviting me by the head of SIGA.
حيث أنني امرأة سياسة.
First, as a woman working in politics,
المساهمة في شأن
trying to contribute to the public affairs.
يعني كنت قد تقدمت بورقة
I presented a paper with the main conclusions that I wanted to share with you. And I don't think, or I don't consider this as a research paper, because studying each of the points objectively requires more time. However, I'm trying to clarify the general atmosphere that about Al-Nahda movement and the problems that faced the party when they dealt with the public sphere. Here, I would like to set a framework for all of the ideas, which is that the media action that we are evaluating in the political activity, whether as an activist in the party or someone in the power, and here we're talking about Al-Nahda movement, doesn't exclude, I mean, the media work of Al-Nahda doesn't exclude having a media work that is free of any orientation or directions, which is built in the Tunisian landscape.
يعني أنا حاولت أعمل بارتاج دكتور
I tried
ما
to
تحصلش.
share my screen, but I was unable.
أشاطركم العرب.
Can you allow me to share the screen?
Can you give Fatima share, please?
She has this option.
Okay, معاكي ممكن تروحي على share screen أستاذة.
أوكي شكرا.
You should be able to share your screen.
طيب يعني لا أدعي أنه بإمكاني إيجاد إجابة شافية ووافية.
I don't claim that I have a complete answer for this question, but I just want to ask some of the questions with you and asking you to think with me in order to find an answer. What if things were different? And what if Al-Nahda didn't come under such a pressure? And what if we didn't have all of these realities in our minds as politicians and activists? Where would we be today?
أحاول. أوكي. هل وصلكم؟
نعم.
نعم وصل.
طيب يعني في خلال التمشي فيما قبل خلال وبعد الثورة
In order
كانت
to talk about the time during
وفي هذه
and after the
الأوقات
revolution, we had some
كانت
major events,
يعني
and these
نسخة أو صورة
in these
كانت
events, the media was a reflection of Tunisia at that point.
كانت محطات
Before the revolution,
متعددة
there
في
were some
قلب كل
prominent
إطارها
points,
وفيما بعدها في محاولة
as well
لبناء
as during the revolution and
المسار التأسيسي
post-revolution,
للدستور حتى
in the process
2004
of
ثم
drafting the
فيما
constitution
بعدها
in
وصولا إلى
2014,
اليوم.
afterwards until today.
يعني تتنوع أنواع الديمقراطية
The types of democracy
بسائن
are
الأحداث التي بعد الثورة
diverse.
التونسية
So some people ask that
وتأسيسها
after the
للديمقراطية
revolution in
ماذا
Tunisia
حدث؟
and establishing this
في أنواعها
democracy, what
تقريبا
happened? In the
الديمقراطية
types of
النسبية
democracy, we have
والمساوية
the
الديمقراطية
parliamentarian
الفعلية
democracy, representative
وتأسيس
democracy, the
الإعلام
democracy of the
والرئاسة والتنفيذ
general opinion,
والديمقراطية
or the public
الرئاسية
opinion,
التي سلطها
and
وسائل
with the
التواصل
direct
والإعلام
democracy, where the
والمجلات الإخبارية
communication
وهنا
media and
يترتب على
social media and
هذا
traditional media,
يعني
then the business
هؤلاء
men,
يكون هم
which
الذين
means the
يحددون
money, can
الأسماء
impact. Those actors are the
السياسية
one that set
والمنحى
the
والتزمين
narrative, the message,
وهذا الذي
the
حدث الآن
direction,
مررنا
and the
بمشهد من
time.
الدكتاتورية
So actually,
في
that's what happened in Tunisia. We
2011
went directly from
إلى
dictatorship in
ديمقراطية
2011
ممارسة.
to a direct democracy.
فيما قبل الثورة كان المشهد
Before the
مختلفا
revolution, the
يعني
landscape of
ترتيبا
media was
ونسقا
routinely
كثيرا جدا
monotonous,
كان
limited,
يحقق
or constrained, and was trying
وهذا
to
كانت يعني
match the narrative
أساسية
of
لا
the state. There
تعني
was
وهي
only
المركز
one
الأول
institution,
للاتصال
which is the higher institution or the
وهو
higher
أصبح في
authority of
الرفيع
communication,
زين
and the only
العابدين بن علي
under the regime of
لا
Zain
بالعكس
al-Abidin
سنة
Ben Ali. It was under the
99
supervision of
ثم
that
بدأت تعود لها مجال
authority.
الإعلام
It was
لكنه
established
بدأ
in
بالاستجداد
1989, and it has
في مايو 2008
functions about the media,
يعني
but all of
انتخب
these functions
نفسه
were
رئيسا
advisory
على
functions. In
الاتصال وهو مؤسسة
2008, the same
وطنية
institute
يتمتع بالشخصية
became a
القانونية
national
والاستقلالية في
institution that
آخره
has a legal
لم
personality
يكن له
and
وظيفة
financially independent, but it didn't
كان
have
يقول أن هذه
an
مسؤولية
important role.
حتى عندما عهد إليه
And even
بإدارة
when
مراقبة
it was
الانتخابات
assigned to
المرشحين
the task
للانتخابات
assigned the task of
هذا
monitoring
عمل
the
صغير
electoral
قد بقي
campaigns and the
مؤشرا بعد
elections. It
الثورة
didn't do
يعني
that work.
ربما
After
منذ
the
2010
revolution, it was
والذي
abolished
قام بانتخاب
by
هيئة
virtue
وطنية
of decree number
للصلاح
10 of
الإعلام
2011.
والاتصال بعد الثورة
And a new
والذي
body was
يمكن
established, which is the
للمشاهدين
National
مشاهدتها
Authority, the Independent
يعني
Authority
في
for
المشهد
Reform, that was tasked
الثورة
with the
يعني
function of the
يتمتع
media.
بغطاء إعلامي هو الأقوى في
During the
العالم
revolution, the
ويأخذ
Tunisian
إشارة
revolution was under the
إلى دور
coverage,
قناة الجزيرة في
a
الثورة
very good
التونسية
coverage. And here
وأيضا
we
إلى
should
دور
mention Al
وسائل
Jazeera
التواصل
channel, as well
الاجتماعي
as
التي شكل نفوذا
social media
كانت تونس
means,
أولى
especially
الدول التي
Facebook,
شكلت
because
بها
Tunisia was
فيسبوك
the first
يعني
case where
وسيلة
Facebook
تواصل
was a
شعبي
very important
وفر فيها
means of
العالم
communication for the
وأحدث
people that built up the
وكانت
momentum that
متشكلة
we have seen.
بثقة إعلامية
On the other
كبيرة
hand, the
وأل
regime
جزيرة وهي
lost
بتمثل
any
المصداقية
media coverage, because all the media, the
وتتفرد
state television
خصوصا
has
قناة الشباب
had
وحاول أن
no
يجلب بها الشباب
credibility
وهذا
whatsoever,
النظام غاب
and the
عن
regime
وسائل
was
التواصل
absent from
الاجتماعي
social
كان
media
يغيب
completely.
فيما بعد الثورة
In the post-revolution period,
تغيرت الأوضاع
things started to
يعني صار
change.
تراجع في دور قناة
For
الجزيرة
example, the role of Al Jazeera
ظهرت
channel
قنوات عربية
retreated. We
وفضائية
started to see
ودولية أخرى
other
تواصل
satellite Arab and international
وتعزز
channels that
الانتشار
are supporting the
ثم ظهر
counter-revolution.
إعلام مقام
And then
المستقبل
we started to see new
ووضع
local
تجديد
media outlets,
إذاعات وفضائيات إلى آخره
as well
الجزيرة
as new
يعني
radio
ترسبت
stations and satellite
وربما
TVs.
خصومنا أو
Our
المعارضة ووسائل
adversaries,
التواصل الاجتماعي
or
ربما
those who are against the
يتهمون
revolution, started to
بهذه
pay a lot of
السياسة
attention
في
to social
المقابل
media,
وقع
and they
تراجع
start to be
نسبي
visible on these
في
issues. At the other hand,
أثناء
uh,
الثورة
we
عبر
who are
السنتين
pro-revolution,
وبدأ ذلك
our
في
influence
انتخابات
started to
2019
decrease, and that
وبداية
started to
الانحدار
happen since the
وبداية تغيير
was clear in the elections of
التحدث
2019.
على هذه الفضاءات
and our visibility on those social media means, for example, especially Facebook, started to be to appear that it is very weak. After the revolution, as I said, there was a national independent authority for reforming media and communication by virtue of Decree number 10 of 2011, and we started to see amplification of audiovisual landscape in Tunisia. We started to see 13 TV channels and 35 radio stations. Uh, this proliferation was within 1 year, 1 year and a half. Then the higher this the HICA, the Higher Association of Audiovisual Communication, became a constitutional independent institution in 2014. Facebook made a difference in the Tunisian revolution, as well as in the moments of coup that we start to see its uh, problems or impacts today. We have 6 million Tunisian people on Facebook. And as you see here in this graph, we surveyed some respondents in the past year, 2 months ago or 1 month and a half. It says, this graph says that about 39% believe the information that come from Facebook and don't believe information that come from other social media or communication media. The least credible one seen by the people, the Tunisian people, are the TV channels, whether public or private TV channels. And even in newspapers, they lost credibility, and the Facebook remains the one that is identifying and setting the general public opinion. I will try to speak about the general landscape, and I'm not going to take or speak about specific cases. After the revolution, there was an explosion of freedom and the work in the media, and even Ziad Krishan, who is the editor-in-chief of Al Maghrib newspaper, and it is an opposition newspaper for consecutive news governments. He wrote in an article, Al Ghad newspaper, he said that the journalism today is a blessing, where you can create the content of your newspaper as you wish, you write as you wish, and the government is afraid to interfere because of the reaction that might come. So the media would have this huge responsibility, and it was directing the public opinion the way it wanted, according to certain agendas. There were some entrenchments of media outlets, and they sided with the counter-revolution, and there were a lot of space in the major news bulletins, for example, to follow up on the protests, demonstrations against the government, and any achievements by the government were absented from these news bulletins. This was hindering the attempt of reform, which didn't go beyond the legal framework. So trying to get journalism from its weak position before the revolution, reaching it to the level of professionalism, and drawing a legal framework for a decent work,
عمل بدون موارد بدون
witnessed a lot of obstacles. A lot of journalists worked without resources, without sufficient training. So those journalists were unable to be or to work professionally. And I believe that understanding the ethics and the basic performance of journalism was not widespread amongst those journalists, and these were amongst the most important obstacles. As you know, the media is an industry, and there are lobbies that control this. Where there, of course, there are the lobbies for the advertisements, announcements, publication, distribution. All of those lobbies are closed and monopolized by in the market for years. Of course, funds or money is the basic of or the basis for professional media work. And we have seen that from the graph that articles and even radio stations or TVs were amongst the weakest links in the media work. We imagine that working in journalism is through official communication or through some other means, but the media is something different. It is about raising the awareness, building the awareness, and it was neglected by the revolting people, which gave rise for the counter revolution. And the battle in the media, which is the major battle, is the one that will be decisive in this work. Now, speaking about the higher authority of the higher independent authority of audiovisual communication. It was established in 2014 with other four authorities. It was assigned to regulate the this field, ensure its independence, trying to get a new way to govern for the governance of media, ensuring the rights, transparency, efficiency, fairness, or unbiased media. And despite the plenty of legislations and laws, it did the work wasn't up to the expected level. There were several chapters speaking about the freedom of expression and media and ensuring that, but we were able to see that the official Tunisian TV stations that were getting their funds aired a press conference for a leftist political group, which is called the Body for Defending the Martyrs. Shukri
بالعيد بالعيد
Shukri Bel'aid.
شكرا بالعيد.
نعم
شكرا بالعيد
معذرة. وأعتقد أنه عندما تبث هذه الندوة بشكل مباشر
And when this press conference is being aired live, it means that you are not following or respecting, upholding these laws and legislations. And we started to see a retreat in media and media to the level before the revolution, that which starts to work according to instructions and directions from the authority. What happened? How did the media outlets tried to create narratives about the Islamists or those all of those who are not uh, to the left or who belong to the spectrum of the secular side of the society? I don't want to get in deeply in this, but if you observe the observation for those who were unable to get into the parliament, they used media because there were lessons from the in history where the left in Tunisia was creative, like arts and the media. They had made a lot of advancement in that field, and that made them create have an advanced position in these fields. They tried to make an impression that go beyond the truth and not telling the truth. Of course, the first pillar of journalism is that the piece of a news is sacred, and then you can have the right to interpret the news the way you want. So what they tried to do is that they tried to make an impression or to communicate their opinions, and this impression showed that when the journalists uh, try to express themselves and more than communicating news. In this model, what did they do? They tried to create a complete narrative. In this narrative, there is uh, a sender and receivers and assistants. And here, the hero who is assigned to achieve or to fulfill a task where he wants to do something. And there are uh, the evil people. But who were the evil people? How these evils were, or the antagonists were created in this narrative in two governments that came after one another. How this narrative was created, that Al-Nahda should be held accountable for everything. It was created through this simple model. Al-Nahda was the antagonist that was hindering the government, or sometimes some figures in the state, and who are trying to achieve or to fulfill all of these services for the people. Was that the truth? I don't think so. But the goal was to defame Al-Nahda in its religious behavior, in this purity, in this struggle. And they tried to give them a lot of accusations, like being hypocrites, thieves. And they started to use some slogans, like, for example, how much is 1 kilogram of struggle? Using such slogans, showing that those people are not really strugglers, and they are trying to make fun of them and to be sarcastic about them. On the other hand, when these forces try to create a bad image about Al-Nahda movement and those who belong to it, so they are trying to create this hero, the pure, the honest, the God-gifted, the patriotic, uh, uh, and this is the very the local culture that we call it min bihla, which means that was used by the president himself, which means that he is blessed by God. He is a gift from God. He is sent from God himself to clean and cleanse the society from those evil people. He is combating corruption, etc., etc. So playing on these issues was making or drawing the image of the hero is simple, and it was easy, also easy to create the image of the antagonist. This narrative was using the political psychology, working on the conscious and unconscious of the crowds or of the public.
At the end of the day, consciousness, rationality constitute a third of human being, when we listen actively, when we interact, but we reach to a limited audience. But in the subconscious, we talk about instincts, where we reach 2/3 of a human being, that people understand through their unconsciousness, through their senses. So we can use cunning, deceit, disguise, and lying. We can use the images, cinema, theater, sketches, and jokes, caricature. All of these tools were used to penetrate and reach to a broad audience. There were some attempts to modify the media approach. You have 5 minutes. Okay, I won't take too long. But the media institutions, which were not rivals to Al-Nahda, were unable to correct the image. They were professionally incompetent and restricted in resources, and had very little PR and no creative communication plan. So they were unable to correct the balance. So we can actually criticize those attempts to restore the balance. So there were those attempts to start some TV channels and to involve people who have the center moderate voices. We had the channel of Al-Mutawassit and Al-Zaytuna, but they suffered, such as Al-Zaytuna. It was shut down actually, and it only continues on the internet right now. So there were many attempts actually for other institutions as well, such as Saraha Radio. So there were some good and serious attempts, but the lack of vision, but the many interveners, and the lack of a single leadership for the media battle, as well as lack of adequate experience and tradition in media work, caused the failure of those attempts. And when that failure took place, there was a mismanagement for the human resources, which were the journalists. So what happened? You had those people who you made into journalists and professionals, and then you failed them when you shut down those institutions, and those people went to other institutions and had to take on their tone and their discourse. So we remained behind in the visual and journalistic level. At the end of the day, there was a siege so to speak, financially, of those channels and radios and newspapers. And also there was lack of experience and mismanagement of the human resources, as I mentioned earlier. So unfortunately, and there were also some restrictions in legal and administrative terms. The implications for Al-Nahda. How have all of those things affected Al-Nahda? Why do we talk about the image of Al-Nahda here? Why do we talk about Al-Nahda as the facade of the Islamic movement? For the time being, Al-Nahda is the largest Islamic party in the country. It has its institutions, it has its operating institutions, even after the coup. And under this enormous pressure, Al-Nahda continues to continue its work, its meetings, and its communication with its constituency. However, those crises and the destabilization have offered an atmosphere that is hostile and instilled dissatisfaction. And all of its efforts in the day-to-day operation after this media war launched against it most of the political effort is focused on countering those attacks, on refuting and counter arguments. And we have an example in a journalistic symposium 2 days ago, which was in response to an earlier media event which was aired on Al Wataniya TV. But this new symposium was meant to refute the argument in a new approach. So Al Nahda addressed this media momentum or press momentum as it wasn't defending itself, but it wasn't it filed lawsuits silently without much media coverage, and sometimes it did not even respond to some of the accusations, although some of them were very serious. And it was this attitude that at the end of the day provided an atmosphere of freedom and offered al-Nahda as a guarantor for stability, for being able to accommodate those blows and to continue to endeavor to improve its work and to improve the atmosphere. However, we can see the impact of that on the elections. In the legislative elections in 2011, al-Nahda was ranked first, given 37% of the votes and 89 seats in the parliament. In the second elections in 2014, the counter-revolution prevailed. It took the first rank, it headed the country and the parliament. It took the majority there, and the Al-Nahda ranked second. Excuse me. I believe that this outcome, if we compare it to the following outcome in the following elections, requires some awareness from our side that Al-Nahda has not just only lost its constituency and popularity, but also it lost its electoral constituency. And I believe that that was the purpose, an attempt to isolate and stigmatize and shrink in size and impact. So in this graph, I tried to put some of the accusations. Let's try to see. For example, this is a statistic about the biggest problems facing the country. According to it was terrorism that was topmost, the biggest threat. But then this threat declined, so to speak. Every time they focus on a certain problem in order to modify their agenda to stigmatize and attack al-Nahda. So every time we have a terrorist attack, al-Nahda is accused either for being complicit or for being incompetent or for actually undertaking the act. So this systematic defamation, I will not linger much on this part, but I can give at least one very clear and recent example where Trust News website that is concerned with refuting fake news that Rashid Al-Ghannouchi was the subject of 53 news items which ran contrary to the ethics of the press work since October 2020, which means more than 4 news items every month. And also on social media, there were between 16 and 11 fake news, 11 misleading news, 4 rumors and 4 sensational news. So in July of 2021, we had the largest number of fake news about the Ghannouchi, and also in during August and September we had like another 6 items. I need 4 or 3 minutes more. Okay, go ahead. So in terms of this systematic deformation or defamation, there was an attempt to break the icons, so to speak, to break the leadership, to discredit the leadership of Al-Nahda. So, for example, Noureddin al-Buhairi, the former justice minister, was accused of being a drug addict, for being trying to monopolize or the judiciary. He is for the time being for more than 44 days on a hunger strike, and they haven't been able to charge him with any legally standing crime. And also Ali Al-Arid, as the former interior minister, was accused of trying to allow bullets against protesters. Anwar Ma'aruf, the communication minister and then transportation minister, is under house arrest for no accusation, but with no charges. All the MPs of Al-Nahda were defamed, particularly the late deputy speaker of the house. So this defamation was also reached also those who allied with Al-Nahda, the prime ministers, the allies, the speaker, Mr. Rashid Al-Ghannouchi. It did not stop there. Even the counter-revolution, even those who are part of the counter-revolution, when they get closer to Al-Nahda and they ally with Al-Nahda, such as Al-Sibsi and the Muhammad Al-Ghrayani, who was an advisor to Al-Nahda, and also those who supported the government after the elections in 2019, such as Qalb Tunis and Tilaf Al-Karama, or the Karama coalition. All of them are subject to defamation. Actually, unfortunately, now they are oppressed by the state authority itself. So the impact of this on the movement was varied, but we can summarize high offices and the offices of advisors and ministers, as they were in the spotlight at any level of administration when they tried to reform or achieve anything or change anything within their mandate. So anyone who belongs to Al-Nahda or who is affiliated with or close to Al-Nahda was targeted by that media defamation, and they had to work so handedly in that minefield in media terms. Also in the parliament, the MPs of Al-Nahda was proactive, and they offered some legislative drafts and they defended their proposals, but they had to work very hard for their proposals to be accepted, and the monitoring of local authorities was lacking, particularly if those local authorities were from a different ideology. So those MPs were subject to some media blackouts or attempts to deprive them of media coverage, to discredit their performance. Actually, all of them and there was a fluctuation in the relations and alliances between the Al-Nahda bloc and the other parts of the spectrum. And also, with every media attack, those who take different sides change, and this hindered the work of the government and the parliament a lot. And there was also a very clear very clear obstacles for the work of the parliament from those media attacks. Those media campaigns did not stop there. Actually, even the relation between Al-Nahda movement and the presidency was a problematic since, or has been problematic since the revolution, as they called the president as the interim president between 2011 and 2014. And they tried to cause a disagreement or dispute between him and Al-Nahda. And you also can see it right now when, in relation to the coup, media has become very often the spokesperson of the coup, but in some other instances you don't find them disposing the truth. You're running out of time. Okay, I'm finished, but I wanted to go through this slide. What if the Al-Nahda was more professional and coordinated between the institutions and offices, and what if there were neutrality, objectivity, governance, and transparency, and good funding for the institutions? Would we have come to this dilemma? Would we have now been facing this coup against the constitution and institutions? That's the question. Thank you so much for this presentation, which I will try to summarize very quickly before we move to the last speaker. Ms. Fatima talked about the impact of media on the events, and she talked about a unified framework. She said that there were some professional media work, but media and the press is always affected by some orientation or instruction, but things cannot be generalized. And then she wanted to pose a question. She said she wanted an overview of media before, during, and after the revolution, and that the democracies are either representative or public opinion based, which is mostly dominated by businessmen and media, and also direct democracy, which is also affected by media persons and businessmen. The media in the state was covered or supervised by a Supreme Media Council in 1989, and then it was changed into a national agency, which was also dysfunctional. After the revolution, we had the National Commission for Media and Communication, and the revolution enjoyed a very strong media coverage, particularly by Al Jazeera and on Facebook. But after the revolution, the situation changed. Al Jazeera's role was less, and we had counter-revolution media, and there was a retreat in the impact of honest media outlets, and there was an independent media commission for the reform of media and communication, but at the same time we had a swelling media sector and also a growing role for Facebook, where 6 million Tunisians were on Facebook, which indicates the importance of Facebook in the formulation of awareness in Tunisia. 39% of Tunisians believe what they read on Facebook. This is according to a poll in 1921, and that the credibility, the least credibility they give is for newspapers. There was also the impact of public opinions and on media in the formation of public opinion, and there were certain specific parts of the news bulletins that would not talk about any achievements or any reforms, which became an obstacle, and there was an inability to translate the freedom that they had to practice in media, because there were some business monopolizers of like advertisers who mostly were against the revolution. So ultimately, the people who were pro the revolution ignored the media, neglected the media, which gave the counter-revolution a lot of space to maneuver. And then we had another commission in 2013 under the constitution in order to guarantee the truth to the people, communicating the truth to the people. However, it wasn't enough, because media became had an agenda that was against the revolution and defaming for both Islamist and leftist revolutionary figures. And they also penetrated into other cultural and media institutions to serve their agendas and replace the truth. And she talked about narratives, how they involve the sender and the receiver, and how there is an antagonist and or a hero and a villain. And the media tried to depict al-Nahda as the villain, and the purpose was to discredit al-Nahda and accuse it of hypocrisy and theft, and also to play down their struggle. This created the narrative which was addressed to the unconscious, to the subconscious, as opposed to the other media outlets that address the consciousness. And the consciousness reaches a limited number of people through because it constitutes 1/3 of a human being, while the subconscious constitutes 2/3 and uses subliminal methods. Of course, the media outlets which were not against the revolution did not respond to it. There were many criticisms, there were many actors, lack of leadership, lack of adequate experience, lack of understanding for the rules of the game in the media, and influence zones. And also there was a failure in the symbols and the language of symbols, and the language used was very dry, and we did not try enough to reach the people directly through other media and cultural avenues. And also there were restrictions in administrative and financial terms. So the implications for Al-Nahda was a direct impact on the atmosphere that focused on the economic and social crises, and the media of Al-Nahda started to be on the defensive, although Al-Nahda did not defend itself directly, but focused on guaranteeing the implementation and the honoring of democracy. And she talked about the impact on elections, where Al-Nahda ranked first in 2011, but then moved second in 2014 and almost the same rank in 2018. So it lost part of its electoral constituency. And then she focused on some problems, or there were some focus on problems in the media coverage in order to accuse Al-Nahda. And she talked about the statistics about the biggest problems facing the country. So there was systematic defamation, and she gave some examples against Rashid al-Ghannouchi and other icons, and there were fake news that continue to be aired on different media outlets against al-Ghannouchi and other Nahda leaders. The purpose was to discredit those leaders and to shed doubt on them. And she gave an example of al-Bahiri, who is on hunger strike for more than 44 days, and this had an impact as well on the performance of ministers as well as parliament members, representatives of Al-Nahda, which caused a dysfunctional parliament and government. And she asked at the end, what if the performance was better, the media and parliament performance, would it have been better? Would we have avoided the coup if we did better? Let's move now to the second speaker, Mr. Ahmed Qalul. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. Peace be upon you all. Thanks for all attendees and listeners. Actually, I can't hear Mr. Ahmed. Can you hear him? Yes, we can hear him. Which channel are you? You have to open the Arabic channel. I said that addressing this question and to tackle so-called political Islam, and the example of which is Al-Nahda in Tunis, is important. However, I believe that we need to study this question in its general context and then focus on the role of Al-Nahda or other Islamic parties in the region for more in-depth understanding. So, the study of Islamic parties, particularly in the Arab world, is important because of the peculiarity of the experience of modern state, the modern nation state in the Arab world, since this nation state was based or built to begin with against a negative attitude towards the Islamic conception or conceptualization of the state. I don't want to overstress this, but I wanted to start with this short introduction before I go into the details of my paper. So we have to address this within its general context, and then I will try to answer the question related to the role of Al-Nahda in that general context. So, of course, the paper which I'm going to present to you is going to be on two parts, and the second part is in two parts in itself. So the first part is theoretical, dealing with revolutions in terms of definition and approaches or academic approaches which deal with the revolution in its relation with the geopolitical or international levels, because this issue of trying to study and understand revolutions within the framework of international relations theories is rather new. Most political science studies study revolutions as a local event rather than a regional or a broader event, although some studies hint at the role of the international context on local revolutions. So if we read John Foreign or Vacant Power, we find that the authors deal with revolutions within the local economic, political, and social context of the country in question. So this question of revolutions within the context of international geopolitics is rather new, and the theories dealing with this discipline are still only nascent, so we don't have fixed, well-established theoretical pillars or standards to use to study the countries which went through a revolution. So this is by way of introduction, but it would be befitting to define the revolution. But in terms of the literature that deals with the revolution, we can uh, categorize them into two categories. One is the category that deals with it ideologically, and another which deals with revolution as part of another discipline or field within the socio-politics. So it is important to point out that most of the studies that were written in sociopolitics were informed by the Anglo-Saxon culture. Very few Francophone studies dealt with revolutions in French, for example. There are very few. I don't know about other languages, but within the literature that I'm acquainted with, this is the situation. I will start with a very quick introduction for the understanding of a revolution. Most definitions that define the revolution of a revolution, whether they use as a term of reference the basic theorists of Marxism or the definitions informed by sociopolitics, uh, we can describe it ultimately as a dramatic event in one of the phases of the change of governance. And of course, this definition would exclude coup d'etats. That's why they make it a condition for those transformations to be accompanied by a grassroots movement that is accompanied by political implications. So those approaches to the understanding of a revolution put the revolution within a model that has a cycle of life. And this life cycle
يمكن أن يعني نصفها بشيء من
can be
العجالة
described briefly
ضمن تقريبا هذه المراحل
on the following 10 stages. So before the revolution, the first stage, we have the system of governance losing the support of the elite, particularly the educated elite. Also, in the revolution, the system of governance, which usually has social and economic crises, tries to do certain reforms. And those reforms usually make us go to the third stage, where there is a deepening of the crisis between the opposition and the system of governance, where the demands of the opposition become even higher, and this leads to a social grassroots movement, which we call the revolutionary incident in the third stage. And after the fall of the system of governance or the existing regime, usually we have conflicts within the ranks of what we would describe as the revolutionaries or the revolutionary elite. The fifth stage usually regards the people and the parties that take power right after the revolution. They are usually moderate. In the sixth stage, the revolution or the popular mood goes into a radicalized stage because of the failure of the moderate parties to respond to the high demands of the political and social strata, because they take power in a weak state with very high expectations. The seventh stage after this failure, usually we have those radical parties that take over power, and they take radical procedures that are structural in the state and that are informed by ideological background. The eighth stage is when we have the imposition of a coercive system of governance in the political life, which we call the cycle of terror. Because this would be the only way to impose the radical revolutionary change. The ninth stage, according to this theory, this radical stage, which begets conflicts, causes or gives rise to the hard power in the state, which are usually the military, and they take over power. And on the 10th, eventually, in the 10th stage, according to this theory, 10 or 20 years later, we have the rationalization of political transition pathway. So as we can see in those 10 stages, which is one of the approaches to understand revolutions, and it doesn't seem too far-fetched, and it applies properly to the French Revolution. And this theory was actually applied before the Arab Spring. Most importantly, in our analysis, this theory gives no role to the international variant or the international context in the understanding of revolutions.
And that makes us look into other theories, which allows us to say that the revolution, it is a dramatic event, but it doesn't cause a rule change. In this aspect, we can get into 6 conditions for the success of the rule change or a transition, and these conditions came out of studying what happened in West Germany and after the World War II and South Africa. This study says that the rule change is basically is a local event, which means the key influential factors for the rule change come from the local actors. This study says that this transformation or this rule change usually witness a civil war or terrorist acts or a war at the regional or international level. But the important thing in this regime change, in the case of South Africa and West Germany, there is commitment or international a strong commitment to support these two experiences on terms of security and the financial and economic aspects. And this at least gives us, in theory, one an eye opening. And in the cases of West Germany and South Africa, and even in some other cases, there was a kind of integration or reliance of part of the former regime. Nevertheless, which didn't happen in the Tunisian experience, that there was application of the transitional justice. And there was also a program that was implemented along the way. The point that is the core of our paper here, and I hope that I will be committed to the time allocated to me, which is the international as the international variant, which is very important in the revolutions. The Tunisian revolution, as an event, it didn't come as an independent incident. It came in international geopolitical condition whose signs start to manifest in 2008, which is, for example, having uh, a new forces on the rise. And here I'm talking about Iran and Turkey, the failure of the terrorists combating terrorism that the United States got into after the fall of the Soviet Union, the return of Russia and China, and the failure of the discourse that says, or the discourse of the Arab countries, especially in relation to the Palestinian cause, and the failure of the Oslo Accords and other models that were made in the region, and the economic crisis that happened in the world, which made the world unable to take on the costs of the Arab regimes that were supported by the world, apart from some Arab regimes. And here I'm speaking about Qatar, or what happened in Syria, for example, where some countries tried to renew themselves, but the Tunisian regime was unable to renew itself. So this international factor allowed to have this space to take a place, and that's why the revolution in Tunisia had its wave that reoccurred in the entire region. So we need to see the revolution in Tunisia within this international lens. In Tunisia, of course, Al-Nahda movement within the Troika was a main party in leading the country, and it was responsible for this period. We can see that there was a difference in during the Troika about, for example, the Syrian issue. There was a clarity or agreement on the Palestinian issue. There were differences on the Libyan issue. And here, when I'm speaking about differences, so we are talking about differences with the former president Al-Munsaf al-Marzouqi, who had an approach that could be seen radical a little bit, especially in terms of the Syrian file. However, the policy of Al-Nahda movement in general in the foreign affairs, they tried to be within the traditional policy of this of the Tunisian state in general, which means, for example, maintaining the relation with the European Union, the relation with the United States, taking our position within the Mediterranean countries. So Al-Nahda didn't call for a radical change in the policies or a new positioning within the geopolitical map. This is very important, and this is also another indicator for after the coup of Qais Said. So any change in this policy, it means that Tunisia will be drawn towards the east or toward the Orient in terms of Iran, maybe, and other forces. So when we speak about the revolution, we need to talk about it within the international space, which means that the world is an one network that is held together. So if you move one piece, other pieces will shake and move around. So these changes will create conflicting willingness. So I have, for example, uh, at least in theory, I have some problem to speak about the revolution and the counter-revolution, because the revolution is not a democratic action, and it could lead to a authoritarian or a tyrannical movement. Usually, after the revolution, you can see a new power that is formed by the old forces and the new ones. Revolutions that create democracy is a new thing that is happening in the world. It started in the 1990s and the first decade of the new century. The policy of An-Nahda movement in the past 10 years, it wasn't radical, and we can describe it as part of the moderate revolutions or governing bodies. So the conflicts between Al-Nahda and others, it was between Al-Nahda and the radical forces, whether they are leftist or other. Those, for example, in Tunisia, we are talking about the constitutional free party, which has nostalgia about the past, or the popularist radical movements, the ones that represented by Qais Said in Tunisia. And those moderate forces, and even the last parliament, the most recent parliament, there was a kind of division between those that we can call moderate or rational people and the radical ones. And this is not a description about the values, which means between the good and the bad. It is a description about what we see on the ground. In general, Al-Nahda moved in its foreign relations in that framework. This was a very important indicator for the survival of Al-Nahda movement. And we can see that the major events that started in Libya, for example, what happened to the American ambassador in Libya, it was a message to the entire world, saying that what we have in Tunisia is as a dangerous thing, and especially the assassination then about some of the members who were from the left and national thinkers. So that was the deconstruction of the components of the revolution, because the left was part of the revolution and they were against Ben Ali before his departure. But these incidents cannot be understood outside the regional agendas that deal with the political change that took place in the region. And that's why Bouteflika, coming back to Algeria after he was receiving treatment in France, it changed the things that are happening in Tunisia, which is the backyard of Algeria. Algeria changed its position, especially after the movement of the United Arab Emirates and Egypt and their interference in Libya. That made Algeria to interfere directly, at least to mediate between the two competitors, Al-Nahda, represented by Al-Ghannouchi, and Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, who is the leader of Nidat Tunis party. That led to finishing the conflict on the constitution and moving towards the elections in 2014. The European Union has a very important role as well for the elections of 2014 to be democratic elections, because there was a there was a tendency by the French, at least, not to allow Al-Nahda to come back and participate in the elections. But the position of the European Union has helped in smoothing the position of France about towards Al-Nahda. The foreign relations that were approached by Al-Nahda movement, they were in line with the positions of Al-Baji Qaid al-Sibsi, but the problem with the foreign relations started to happen when Qais Said came to office. Qais Said, for example, was against the changes in the Libyan position. There was a radical difference. He has a strong difference in the relation with Turkey, and it can be understood within the Russian agenda to expand into the Moroccan countries.
ضمن التحولات الجدية التي وقعت في المنطقة في الفترة الأخيرة. أولا نحن نشاهد، وهنا أنا أشير لمخرجات.
And here I'm mentioning, Mr. Ahmed, how much time do you still need? I'm summarizing. I reach toward the end. So what happened in Syria, in Libya, and this agenda was expanded to Tunisia, and we started to see Qais Said as a phenomenon in Tunisia, in the political landscape in Tunisia. Can this situation continue? Actually, the continuation of this phenomenon is related to the situation in the world, especially what is happening in Ukraine and in other parts of the world. So the Tunisian case is linked with what may happen, maybe forgetting about Tunisia or focusing on Tunisia. For example, in World War II, the NATO countries focused on Tunisia for its relation with the Mediterranean and the North Africa. So these scenarios, nobody can speak about very surely, because there is a kind of loose ends that nobody knows what will happen. Understanding the Tunisian geopolitical position and its relation with the relation with the Turkish role as a new player or actor in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Sub-Saharan area. But these are factors of conflict that are still materializing. So the entire region is open to new conflicts, and there could be some incidents that may allow the agenda of Qais Said, which will allow the United Arab Emirates to move forward in the Russian agenda, the agenda's expansion in the Occidental countries and the Sub-Saharan countries. And these incidents happened in the history of this region, but partially. Al-Nahda movement is aware that it needs to keep the position of the Tunisian state and its policies within the strategy that can be described as traditional strategy in the international relations with opening or with openness to the regional depth of Tunisia, and here I mean the relation with with Algeria and Libya. So the policies in Tunisia should not go beyond or against the policies of Algeria, and it must be in line with the policies of the European Union and the United States. And I believe this approach is an approach to secure the situation, politically speaking, and it led to a kind of isolating Qais Said. Finally, I would say that the internal factor that are facing regime change is an important factor, and it will have an important position in the coming phase, especially in areas that are facing the danger of wars, civil wars or other kind of wars. So it will remain an important factor, and it will be seen by the international factors. There is still another factor that I don't have the time to speak about. So we have the social trends, which means the new trends in the world, which speaks about that the world is facing today real waves or influxes of popularist movements that are moving. The performance of Al-Nahda movement can be described as the following. It was a good student dealing in its international relations, so it had a strong international relations, but the weakness was that Tunisia didn't receive international commitment to protect it from the international or regional conflicts that are taking place, and here I mean the countries in the Gulf and the Russia that are trying to make any interference in this area. The last point, the international trends, including the popularist movement. Tunisia is part of the world, so it was impacted by it. And this time, we see that Tunisia is being tested in the current period to see whether Tunisia will survive these trends with the radical trends, and will be able to get back the freedom which will move Tunisia from to a new position that whose nature is not identified very well. And I'm sorry if I took very time. I hope that I delivered my message clearly. Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. His paper speaking about studying Al-Nahda movement in general contexts of the politics in Tunisia, and he said that there have been changes that took place in our region, and I believe that he means in the past 200 years, and the establishment of the modern state and understanding the nature of the state. And he is trying to answer the question about the foreign relations of Al-Nahda movement. He says that his paper, part of it was in theory and another part in as a response to the revolution of Al-Nahda movement. And then he said that studying the revolutions in the international relations, and he mentioned a book, maybe it is for Jack Paul Smith, if I'm correct, because he wrote about this matter in 2005. He mentioned that revolutions come from two aspects, either by ideological studies, most of which go back to the theorizing Marxist theorizers, or some of them coming from the Anglo-Saxon, or little of the Anglophone writers. He said that there are periods of the revolution: the pre-revolution, which receives the support of the elites and the educated people. Then then there will be the regime calls for reform. Then deeper problems with the opposition. Then there will be the revolutionary mobilization, and people go to the streets. And then there will be the revolutionary elites. The fifth phase, there will be political parties that will take control, and usually they are moderate parties. And then the people will get more to radicalization, because the moderates will be very unable to meet the needs of the people. And the seventh period, we will start to have new structures with ideological backgrounds, and it will start to have a coercive approach in life, and the one that he called the revolutionary terrorism, in order to achieve the goals of the revolution. And then we have the hardcore of the revolution that will take control, and within a decade there will be rationalization of the country. He said that this study was made before the Arab Spring revolutions, but it didn't give the international role in these revolutions. Then he spoke about the success of the revolutions and about the regime change, but it starts from local actors. He spoke about the regional impact and the international impact and geopolitical impact, and he spoke about the revolution in Tunisia. And he said that after 2008, with the rise of regional powers like Turkey and Iran, and the return of China to the international scene, and the failure of the United States in the combating terrorism, and the failure of the Arab systems and the Arab countries in some issues like the Palestinian issues, as well as the rise of other regional forces like Qatar and Al Jazeera, gave opportunity for political transition in Syria. And then he talked about the Troika period after the revolution and the first elections. He said that there wasn't agreement on all of the files. There was disagreement on the Libyan and the Syrian issues, although there was agreement on the Palestinian issue. Another tried on the period to keep up with the main lines of the foreign policies, or the foreign policy in Tunisia, in terms of the dealing with the European Union and the Mediterranean issues. He said that the revolution is not a democratic action, but at the time the international the international position was very critical, especially the French position, and the changes that happened after the assassination of the American ambassador to Libya. And that what happened in Tunisia was a major event, and it was what was expected from the or what was meant by the adversaries was to destroy the political elite in Tunisia. And then the change in the Algerian position led to the agreement between Al-Sibsi and Al-Ghannouchi. France didn't want the participation of Al-Nahda in the elections, against unlike the general European opinion about that. The real break happened after Qais Said came to power. There was a huge difference in so many issues, especially the relations with Turkey, the expansion of Russia more in the area, and the Syrian issue. Al-Nahda movement was defeated with a strategic and with the position of Turkey and its expansion in the area. He said that the region is open to several scenarios, and there is an agenda, a Western agenda about the region. He said that this deepening might lead to a deeper difference, and Al-Nahda is trying to have a position in the general strategy of the state and to be open to the regional powers, especially openness to to Algeria and Libya, and not to be against the policies of Algeria. In conclusion, he said that the local factor will remain important in the revolutionary phase, but it cannot confront the main international trends, and there should be monitoring the new trends in the world, especially the rise of the popularist movement. And Al-Nahda movement was able to maintain its relations with, and they observed the rise of some powers, but it didn't receive any international commitment to protect the revolution in Tunisia from the interventions of some countries like the United Arab Emirates and Russia and other countries. And he concluded with a question: would this be, would the Al-Nahda movement be able, with the other revolutionary forces, to face these challenges or not? Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. And now we move to the last session of this, the last intervention in this session by Mr. Salah Din Jorashi, and it will be about Al-Nahda and its performance.
Thanks for having me and for involving me in this symposium, which clearly comes in a very important context at the level of Tunisia as well as at the regional level. Speaking of the hardcore or the hard power and the relation with security and the army is a very critical and sensitive issue that requires much accuracy and detail, and because it has its bearing in any country or any political movement anywhere, because social or political powers and parties that do not take into consideration the institutions of the army and the security and have them and factor them into their policies would have a problematic progression track. If we go back to Tunisia, the Islamic movement was born in a political and in a hostile political and security environment. That's not that wasn't only because of security considerations, which is to say considerations related to the stability of the governance regime, but because the Islamic movement in Tunisia was the antithesis of the Bourguibian ideology, because Bourguiba and his circle and his party had a vision for the state and the social order, while the Islamic movement in its nascent years was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood and has Salafi ideology that was in direct contrast with the ideology of Bourguiba and his circles. Another remark to make is that since the beginning of the emergence of the Islamic movement, it clashed at an early stage with the state and with security agencies, because when this movement emerged, it tried to live on two or survive on two levels. So the upper level was the declared activity in the mosques, the schools, or the lessons, and mobilization of people. And in that level, the movement looked average, social movement. Anyone would deal with it without any ambiguity. But behind those early blossoms, there was the establishment of an undeclared organization, which naturally was found out by the security agencies, which observed its activities and its emergence and started to look for those who stand behind that social and cultural religious activity. And gradually, things moved in a direction where the security agencies found out that there was a nuclei for a movement that was emerging behind the scenes. In that very critical context, the leadership of the movement, to be more specific, Mr. Rashid al-Ghannouchi, from the very beginning, he was in contact with the Muslim Brotherhood and was very much acquainted with their history and was affected by the organizational attitude or the organizational structure introduced by Hassan al-Banna. Hence, he started to push the movement and the group to the binary sort of organization, which means we have a political organization with its political manifestation, etc. But in addition, he started to create a secret part of the organization within that very critical circle, which is the military and security. So we have a number of people from the security, the military, or the customs who were attracted by that movement very sensitively and be involved in that secret structure. So the movement started from the beginning to deal with the situation in Tunisia on two levels: on a declared social level in mosques, universities, and schools, etc. And it started to go to the dynamo or the mobilizing force, which is the circles of the security and the military. At the beginning, this secret apparatus, so to speak, was meant for the protection of the movement and to try to understand some information about the internal proceedings within those agencies to avoid any clash, but also at one point in that latent conflict, that defensive attitude became an offensive attitude. So there were some plans to confront the project of Bourqiba, which was in its dying phase anyway, through trying to topple Bourqiba from power, but through a coup d'etat supported by a civil movement in order to topple Bourqiba and put and to install instead of him a certain political alliance in 1987. But this operation was postponed since Ben Ali, General Ben Ali, preempted that 24 hours before it was planned, and he toppled Bourqiba. But it was found out at the time, it was really revealed that this movement had two manifestations, one that is declared and obvious, and another which was secret, latent in the military and security, that it had a sort of a military arm. Of course, this revelation or discovery was an important element in deepening the mistrust between Ben Ali and Al-Nahda movement. Hence, the movement lived its worst or went through its worst stages through the fierce oppression by Ben Ali against Islamists of all across the spectrum.
هذا الاكتشاف كان خطير وكان مهم.
And this was a serious discovery or revolution because it deepened the crisis with the security agency, which became almost specialized in conflict management and liquidation of Islamists of all sorts, and also it created a sort of fear from the military or within the ranks of the military and the security to find out whether there were any further attempts to infiltrate those institutions by the Islamic movement. So we note here that this crisis continued until the eruption of the revolution. The revolution changed the roles and changed the scene, and there was a remarkable change of positions as Al-Nahda movement, after being on the run, very weak, always at the side of the opposition, but much of its opposition was outside the country anyway. It was suddenly after the revolution moved from the opposition to position of power. And the important thing to say here that when Al-Nahda became the head of the Troika and took over the security agencies, it was keen from the very beginning to take the Ministry of Interior, and it was a deliberate step because they regarded it as the wild animal which was always used as a threat to its existence. It wanted to tame that animal and to reassure it that it wasn't there to eliminate it, but to restructure its relation with those agencies. And he hence started the experience of the Interior Ministry and the security and the new relation with the security apparatus. When Al-Nahda chose its minister for the interior with a person who spent like 15 years in prison and very well known for the Ministry of Interior, as he was oppressed by it for a significant part of his life. He was the man chosen for the domestication process, so to speak. However, there were certain mistakes, some of which were deliberate and some of which were necessarily implied by the practice. And till now, the movement lives with the implications of those mistakes. Those mistakes, for example, include that when we have this revolutionary upheaval and unrest in Tunisia, the opposition and parties in civil society organizations wanted to stage protests on the 9th of April, which is a historic date in Tunisia in its confrontation with the French mandate. But it looks like the Ministry of Interior at the time were concerned about allowing those protests in the Bourguiba street, which was a main street, and there we had a confrontation between most of the leaders who took to the streets themselves in order to take part in the protests, and the security agencies. Hence, Mr. Rayad, the Minister of Interior, and Al-Nahda were accused of oppression against democrats and against revolutionaries after the revolution, because they had taken over the Ministry of Interior, and that had its adverse implications for Al-Nahda. The other mistake, which was rather grave, was that in one of the states of Tunisia, we had a movement calling for development, and in this collective movement, a number of citizens decided that they would try to leave their city towards Algeria in a symbolic move, and there was a clash between the the security forces and the citizens, and some security officials allowed the use of rifles used by poachers, usually locally known as Al-Rush, and everybody knows this incident as the incident of Al-Rush. And of course, the Minister of Interior was held to account, or the responsibility was laid on him for that problem. But although he was acquitted later, but the impression that remained in people's mind was that the Al-Nahda used force against democrats and revolutionaries. On another level, or in another context, there were two issues that had much adverse impact on the image of Al-Nahda and the depiction of its mismanagement of public life. The first was the ambiguous relation with the Salafi movement, particularly the Salafi jihadi movement, which arose quite strongly during the Troika rule. And there were certain mistakes in which the movement did not understand the structure or the idea of that counter movement, and Mr. Rashid Al-Ghannouchi thought he can contain it in one way or another, but at the end of the day he found out that this movement was not concerned with alliance with Al-Nahda or with Muslims in general, but had its own agenda and ideology, and had its international or regional extensions, regardless of the local givens. So the movement was rather late, and Nahda was late to understand the threat this movement constitutes, particularly after the statements by Rashid Al-Ghannouchi after his meetings with those people, when he said that those people remind me of my young years, and I would have taken up arms if I was so young as well. So, and this remained in people's minds. Another issue was the issue of assassinations, those political assassinations, which continue to be a matter of fierce debate. And of course, nationalists and the far left accuse Al-Nahda for planning and the assassination of Shukri Bil-Eid and Barahmi, although they have no proof for that effect, and that they take part in the judicial process, in which the indicators show that Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Sharia, Al-Qaeda arm in Tunisia, were responsible for those assassinations. But given the context of the political failure to manage the governance, the socio-economic crisis, etc., it was hard to distinguish the facts. In that context came as well the Egyptian lesson. The Egyptian lesson was the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood to manage governance and the failure to protect themselves when they were in power. And there are multiple failures, and allowing the military institution to give them a deadly blow. This caused the concern by Rashid Al-Ghannouchi and his circles that the miscarriage of a revolutionary progression, a revolutionary track happened from within because of the military role, without intervention by international powers to regain balance or reintroduce balance of power for peaceful political process. So this lesson created a sort of awareness in the ranks of Al-Nahda, So Ennahda started to distance itself from power after having been accused of those many accusations, as I mentioned earlier. But despite this tactical withdrawal and acceptance of a national dialogue and contribution or participation, in the legislative elections, the mistrust or the trust crisis did not go away between the Al-Nahda and the military and security agencies. In this context, after 2019, we had the sudden and strong rise of Qais Said, who was a university professor with no political history, but who was trusted by Tunisians and elected to be president. And here we notice that Qais Said, from the very early moments, started to prepare for, lay the ground for a quantum change in the governance regime in the country, and he started to use the slogan of the reharmonization of the military and security, and that all those who take up arms should be in one institution, in terms of command, in terms of the terms of reference, not in terms of structures. We still had both institutions, so their terms of reference would be the presidency, basically. And despite the fact that this went contrary to the constitution, he was able to put it in effect. So he invested in the discomfort or unease with the government of al-Mashishi and al-Nahda, and that this popular dissatisfaction with al-Nahda was exploited by Qais Said, where he started did his move on the 25th of July. On the 25th of July, the al-Nahda found itself with no institutional background. The parliament was frozen. The government was dismantled, and the representatives or new ministers had nothing to do with al-Nahda. And then we had a massive mobilization against al-Nahda, and which reduced al-Nahda to a defensive position, not only defense of the democracy as a track it has chosen, but also defense of its own existence and its own structure and figures. And this did not prevent the security apparatus and the president to try to chase down some of its figures, which indicates that we are gradually moving towards direct confrontation between Qais Said and security and military apparatuses, from, on the one hand, supported by some small parties and who are against the al-Nahda revolution, movement, against, on the other hand, al-Nahda and other parties that still don't want to align with al-Nahda or to create a common front to defend democracy, because they don't want to be swallowed by al-Nahda or be used by al-Nahda in a battle when they come back to the front line. What I want to conclude by pointing out two important issues. First of all, there is a strong endeavor right now in media or political terms to lay the responsibility on al-Nahda for the failure over the past 10 years. Hence, public opinion is being mobilized in an attitude that is demonizing for al-Nahda, that it constitutes a threat to the state and to the revolution. That's on the internal level, and this has succeeded to some extent, and it requires al-Nahda to review its own tactics and to review its work critically in order to be able to continue in the future. And the other very important thing is that the army, after standing very strongly with Mr. Qais Said and securing the fall of the old regime and trying to stumble the democratic course, it's trying to keep its distance right now, of course, for international and strategic considerations. Hence, we don't know how the military would move in the coming period, but it's clear that in the internal circles, the situation is going in a direction, a strange direction, since Qais Said is that type of person who will see what he does through. He will not take a step back, even if his mistake is so grave and so clear. And this is going to be make the life of Al-Nahda even harder. And it seems to me, as an observer and not someone affiliated with Al-Nahda, that Al-Nahda has taken a tactical approach, and that those tactical procedures constitute avoidance of an all-out confrontation with the military and security institutions. We don't want also at this stage to be involved in an all-out battle in which it goes into a battle with the political rivals, the Qais Said and his allies, and Nahda wants to be involved in this battle with other parties or to intersect with other parties, so that the idea that this battle is between Al-Nahda on the one hand and Qais Said on the other, this bipolar depiction of the of reality. The Al-Nahda doesn't want this to be instilled in the public mind. That's why it wants to go into this battle with others. And now we're starting to see some parties who are trying to ally or get closer to Al-Nahda. And also Al-Nahda is starting to count on international support by standing up for the democratic values and by having campaigns in Europe and American circles in order to draw the attention of the international community that should support the democratic track in order not to find itself in another confrontation that requires it to provide much sacrifice. It depends also, it relies on trying to depict the conflict in its reality, that it is a conflict, it's a crisis of freedoms, a problem of freedoms, rather than a problem with Al-Nahda. And it's a problem of human rights. Al-Nahda is calling for human rights and considers itself one of the defenders of human rights in Tunisia. It's also waiting to see the implications and ramifications of the financial and economic crisis, which has become very tight because Tunisia is such a low-income, limited-income country, depending on interaction with international players. And if we have this dwindling of funding and this economic collapse, this is going to make the regime in Tunisia, and it may make Qais Said modify their policies. Otherwise, Tunisia would be doomed. So to summarize, Al-Nahda, from the very beginning, it tried to think of infiltrating the military and security institutions in order to make them an arm of an extension of itself to succeed, but it failed, and it it backfired on its policies, and made it enter into a dark and long conflict against the revolution, against, sorry, the regime, particularly at the time of Ben Ali, and the revolution came to rescue Al-Nahda, and Al-Nahda tried to be an active player in this revolution. However, they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the programs, nor did they have the human resources necessary to run and manage the state at a very difficult time, although now the time is even harder. But Al-Nahda remains a very important and a strong player, and it's unlikely that we would expect it to be obliterated, but its survival would be contingent upon certain conditions at the national level to survive as a national political movement at a time when Tunisia is going through one of its most critical historical moments. So Al-Nahda would either remain as a national political movement able to learn from the lessons of the past, or it would disintegrate from within, which we can see precursors for right now. Hence, Al-Nahda should not only try to or think how to go back to take power, because power has also actually been detrimental to Al-Nahda, but it should think at a strategic long-term level to provide the political, socio-economic dynamics that allow for a political progression. Thank you so much for this very valuable presentation. Mr. Salah ad-Din talked about the relation between the Al-Nahda movement and the security and military institutions, that it had its implications for the political parties, and if they we don't take this into consideration, the parties would face much problems. The Islamic movement was the antithesis of the Bourguibian project, and it had, because Bourguiba had his own vision for society and economy and politics, while the Islamic movement was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a contrast with that ideology, and they went into confrontation from the early days. And it worked on two levels, the declared level in the mosques, the mobilization of citizens, talking about identity and Islam, and that the movement looked like a social movement. But also there was another level, which is the undeclared secret structure, and the security apparatus started to find out about that secret structure. The leadership of the movement, Mr. Rashid, was affected by the Muslim Brotherhood and the structures introduced by Hassan al-Banna, and he called for the binary structure, the one that is declared, and another which was secret through the infiltration of the structures of the security and military apparatus. So the movement worked on both levels, but it antagonized the security and the military, and that secret level was meant to protect the environment and to give it intel on security information, but this went from the defensive to offensive by trying to top 87, but this was preempted by General Ben Ali, who staged his own coup 24 hours earlier, and the secret structure of Al-Nahda was found out, and this development created an important stage on the history of this movement, and it created a crisis of trust between the state and the movement. So the movement was in its first stage with the oppression of Islamists by the state, as the security apparatus started to crack down on them, and they tried and this crisis continued until the revolution. But after the revolution, the scene changed and the positions changed as the Al-Nahda moved from the opposition to power, and he believes that this was a mistake, and it took over the Ministry of Interior to try to tame the wild animal which was used to crush it earlier, and to reassure it at the same time that it's not trying to eliminate it, but trying to manage it. But there were some mistakes in the management of the Ministry of Interior, and he mentioned a number of mistakes that the Nahda movement made, such as the 9th of April, when the Ministry of Interior clashed, or the security apparatus clashed with protesters. And the other mistake was with some movements in certain states by citizens, when they clashed where there were clashes between young people and security apparatus, and it was known as Al-Rush incident. And the attitude was, it was the mistake of the Minister of Interior, although he was not responsible. There were a number of mismanagement instances in the history of Al-Nahda, particularly the ambiguous relation with the Salafi and Jihadi movement, because Al-Nahda did not understand and recognize the competition from that movement, and it thought it could contain it, but they were late to find out how critical or how serious this was, and this created some issues exploited by the far left, particularly with the political assassinations, which the movement was accused of, although the arm of Al-Qaeda in Tunis was responsible for them. And then came the lesson from Egypt, with the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood and the miscarriage of the revolution, with no international support to the revolution or to the peaceful action. And this was an important lesson, and that international powers actually supported the coup instead of supporting the restoration of the peaceful track, and this pushed it to a tactical acceptance of alliances and dialogue. After 2019, we had the rise of Qais Said, who was a university professor, who was elected president, and since the very beginning he started to lay the ground for a quantum change in the political regime, and by changing the point of reference of the military and the security and apparatus to make it the presidency, although that was in contrast with the constitution, and that was critical for Al-Nahda. And then at that point he staged his coup and dissolved the parliament and the government, and Al-Nahda found itself in defense of democracy and its own survival. But nonetheless, the president tried to clash with Al-Nahda, and although he was only supported by smaller parties, the Tunisian parties refuse to be with Qais Said, but also refuse to ally with Al-Nahda, so they are not swallowed by it. At the end, he talked about two issues, which is that many seek to mobilize the public opinion to make it believe that Al-Nahda is responsible for all the failure, and he called for a revision of all performance and a reassessment of all scenarios that it's going to face. The other issue is that after this democratic, that the army, after it supported the president at the beginning, has taken a step back and is keeping its distance, and it's hard to predict where things are going, particularly that Qais Said is the kind of person who would see things through no matter what, and this is going to complicate issues for Al-Nahda movement, but it seems that they are using a tactical approach, particularly not wanting to escalate the situation with the military and the security. They don't want to be involved in this battle on their own, but they want to have some allies so that they don't instill the image that this conflict is between Al-Nahda and Qais Said, and they count on international support and the defense of legitimacy and democratic progression, and that's why they work on campaigns in Europe and America. The problem is not the problem of Al-Nahda, but a problem of the human rights. And also there is the financial crisis and the economic collapse, which has its implications, which may cause the fall of Qais Said anyway. To conclude, Al-Nahda tried to create an arm within the security and the military, and it failed. It went through a dark stage during Ben Ali, but the revolution saved it, but it didn't have the capacities, human resources, or the visions to understand the situation or to manage the situation, but it remains an important player with its allies and rivals in the region as well as internally. But now it goes through its most difficult era. It either reviews its performance or it will disintegrate from within, and it has to think about very important questions, not only how to take back power. Thank you so much, Mr. Salahuddin. Now we are done with our presentations. Now we have our commentators. Our first comment, please go ahead. You have 10 minutes. In the name of God, the merciful, compassionate.
أود أولا أن أشكر مركز دراسات الإسلام.
First, I would like to thank SIGA and Dr. Samuel Aryan for giving me this opportunity to be part of this important symposium. I would like also to thank the presenters and speakers, Ms. Fatima Toumi, Mr. Ahmed Kalour, and Mr. Salahuddin for their rich papers and that help to conduct the evaluation, which is the main purpose of this symposium. I would like also thank my colleague in Mr. Assam Abdel Shafi, who the other commentator. And I hope that we will be useful. I read the three papers before they have been presented by the speakers, and I saw some differences of what I have seen in the beginning from the paper that I received from Dr. Fatima, and what she presented, and what she presented was richer and a little bit different. That's why I'm not going to talk about the details of the papers, especially that the time will not allow us to do so. But I have put down some comments on these papers, and I see myself, I agree in general about what's happened, what was mentioned about that, which is the foreign relations, the media, and the hard power or the hardcore of the movement. So my comments, I hope that the time will be helpful to cover these comments, which will be useful for the entire movement or the experience. When we are speaking about the experience of a Nahda movement, we need to pay a look at the Tunisian society itself, and it is a society that was that yesterday was described as a small society. We're talking about relatively 12 million strong, mostly educated, and we don't see the same level of education in other Arab societies. And the other point is that for about a century, it was under the purposeful exhibition of its Islamic identity. We're saying it is for decades, for a century, because it was the time of the French mandate or the French colonization, and then the time of Bourguiba. and here I'm generalizing, and I hope that it is not um, a misfortunate or not a missing generalization, that there was an westernization of the identity in Tunisia. The second point is about the Tunisian revolution. Through what we have heard from the papers and how it was called, it was the Freedom and Dignity Revolution. It came at a certain point in time, but the main points or the main titles of this, that people were fed up with the tyranny and the corruption and the affiliation with the West. So these were the three main topics for the revolution, or the main drivers for the revolution in Tunisia. In Tunisia, as its people know and the experts know, there was marginalization. In Sudan, we say that there were marginalized areas like the north versus the south. In Tunisia, we speak about the coastal areas versus the landlocked areas. So the development in the central or the landlocked areas were underdeveloped in comparison with the coastal areas, and these were some of the points that Qais Said worked on in his electoral campaign. So the revolution was surprising for the political elite, as we heard yesterday, and that it is well known, including Al Nahda movement. In the revolution, or after the revolution, Al Nahda movement didn't receive the majority of seats in the first elections. I'm sorry. The Al Nahda movement got the largest or the majority of seats after the revolution, not because it has a strong program for governance, but because people sympathized with it because of its uh, the injustices and the grievances it went through during Bourguiba and Ben Ali governments. That's why Al Nahda received the majority of votes in the first elections. The other point is that we should not look at the Tunisian experience, and that was clear in the paper of Dr. Ahmed Maloul. And I agree with him that we should not look at the Tunisian case as an isolated case, looking at it in separation from other cases with its own peculiarities. No, it is part of the Arab experiences and people who want to change, and those who are calling for Islam to rule them. And this is very important to look at the tracks of democracy and revolutions. The fourth point, the length of governance of movements that are based on Islam, and the injustice that they were under, or the oppression they were under during the past periods, didn't allow them to implement the slogans of the rule of Islam on the ground. So when they got into powers, their credits to do or their experience in governance were similar to the tyrannical regimes that were ruling in the past decades, because they didn't have any practical experience in governance, or at most it was very limited. Another movement applied about 37% in the first elections, and then 27% in the other elections, but to implement its projects. In addition, the westernized elites didn't allow them to get to the hardcore power, and the hardcore that was the Mr. Salah al-Qurashi talked about, and the soft power that Ms. Fatima spoke about, which is the media and social media. So these areas remained almost protected by the old state or the former elites from being penetrated by the Islamists. So, away from exaggeration or under or looking down at what we call the conspiracy theory, the movement got into got its share of experience. So the hidden conflicts, and that was mentioned in the paper of Mr. Ahmad, the conflict between Islam and the West. So the West that is hiding behind the cloak of democracy and the human rights, tried to have some movements that are close to the Islamic movement into governance. It happened in the Iran, in Turkey, with Hamas, and in the Arab Spring revolutions in Tunisia, and it is different from one state to the other. I want to remind here that the impression that the West is the one that protects human rights and democratic values is not precise, and at least the practical implementation in the or the practical experience in the Arab Spring, when these values go in contradiction with the higher values, which are the national security, the priority is given to security, not to the promotion of democracy. That was very clear in the Egyptian case, because Egypt has relations with Israel, and it has a very central role in the Arab world. So it was not allowed to be ruled by an Islamic regime. We didn't expect that, or we didn't understand that at the time, and I believe that this can be learned from to see the solution or the rule that the role that the relation with Israel has, and how that can be protected in Tunisia and other countries. There is also a civilization conflict of civilizations, and this has started after the hegemony of the Western and European countries over the world, and that the world can follow their suit. So there was a major change that can push forward the democratic experience, and that was presented in the paper of Mr. Ahmad, that there was a push in the 90s for new democracies, but that was completely different after September 11. After the 9/11 incident in the United States, the Islamic countries started to be categorized as an environment inducing to terrorism, and the Islamic movements started to be designated as terrorist groups, and that is a purposeful categorization or designation in order to curtail their movement. So of course, this can be brought back or attributed to Fukuyama and Huntington when when they spoke about the end of history and the conflict of civilizations. So we should not look down about this issue, but we need to pay a very critical look at that. What I want to mention against this backdrop is that the Islamic movements after the Arab Spring found themselves accused of terrorism, accused of backwardness, and accused of being unable to manage a state or to run a state, and they don't have answers for modern concepts like democracy and the relation between the state and religion, etc., etc. Finally, and there were nahda of these defaming campaigns was continuing. First, because it represented a model that has a relation between democracy and Islam, and that was a threatening to the extremist Western ideology, and it tried to remain on top of the political landscape for a decade. So what happened in the 25th of July 2020? This is a question. Is it a part of the war against the Islamic movement in power, or is it because of internal factors and dynamics? I would say my answer to this question is that it is a kind of both, but it's not the place to elaborate on that. And I conclude my comment is that the confrontation between the Islamic movements and the Western powers that are in alliance with Israel and other Gulf states, and those are the so-called counter revolution forces. And by the way, we need to understand that Israel is not far away from that, and Mr. Dr. Sami maybe is more experienced in that. So this confronting this alliance is not in the interest of those movements at the current time. So we need to follow the path of dialogue and elaborating the vision of the Islamic movements towards these international concepts at the current time. Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Ubaid, for this revision and these comments for the three papers. And now we have Dr. Isam Abdel Shafi, the second commentator on the three papers. The floor is yours. Peace be upon you. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most bountiful, I would like to thank Dr. Sami Arian and Siga for this invitation and for this symposium. And I would like to thank again being here. Thank them for inviting me again here. I was here in the symposium on Sudan and in Egypt, and I'm continuing to be here in these symposia. As for these papers, we are speaking about the three main topics: the media issue that Ms. Fatima talked about, the international factor that Dr. Tanoun spoke about, and what can be called the civilian military relationships that Mr. Salahuddin spoke about. I don't know personally any of the three speakers that who spoke today, and I don't have any previous positions, but some comments come from what I read on the papers. And today I feel very satisfied about the papers that were presented and the interventions that were made. I feel that regardless of agreeing or disagreeing with some of the content, but in comparison with the papers that were presented in the first day, I feel that there is a huge difference between the in terms of the methodology and the building of the realities in the papers. So from a personal point of view, I can say that each of these papers requires an extended workshop in order to understand the papers, analyze them, and come with a roadmap or the action points based on the papers. I received the papers about 2 days ago. I read them, and as Dr. Al-Ubaid said, the paper that we received from Ms. Fatima is completely different from the presentation that we have seen today, because at the end of the paper that she sent, she said that it was just a summary, but what she presented today was a very distinguished paper. My comment will be on a title that was really attractive, which were, and it was repeated several times, which was the lesson from the Egyptian experience. Unfortunately, the lessons from the Egyptian experience was present in the Tunisian experience. However, it wasn't a lesson that we learned from. It was a present in terms of the media outlets and how to deal with that. It was a present in terms of managing the civilian military relationship, but it wasn't learned from in the Tunisian experience, and it was present in terms of drawing out the ideological sources for the movements, political movements of Islamic backgrounds.
وخاصة أن ملف نعم الميكروفون حاضر الدرس المصري
The
أيضا
Egyptian lesson was also present in terms of the international aspect and the international relations. The coup in Egypt, as so many learned, it wouldn't have succeeded without the regional support and the international acceptance and approval in this field. But this international support as well wasn't learned from as a very important lesson for the Tunisian experience. Most of the papers today, and even the summary of the paper that was presented by Mr. Ahmed, says that Al-Nahda is still relying on the international aspect. And I believe this is a lost bet. As of now, I can tell you that this is a lost bet because Al-Nahda will not achieve what it wants, especially that Mr. Al-Ubaid said that when we speak about an international aspect, it has to do with the agenda of Al-Nahda and how much it is in line with international and regional tendencies. And I don't think that the international and regional tendencies accept Al-Nahda to be in power. Now I will go back to the Egyptian lesson. Some people or some of the speakers said that some of the main bits in Egypt, for example, Mr. Salah said that Al-Nahda has our betting about the impact of the economics on the regime, and that this is something that Al-Nahda can depend on for the fall or the regime. I believe this is also we should not exaggerate on this betting, because the same happened in Egypt. The political powers depended on that and said that the regime will face problems, economic problems, for years, and it didn't fall. And almost every month in Egypt, the regime announces a new loan or agreeing on and receiving a new loan. So the regional and international financial support continues to flow to the regime because he is good at the political blackmailing, and all the regional and international powers depend on the regime to be there to advance their agendas as well. This is one aspect. Another other comments, quick comments. There is a real problem. The defamation, if you allow me to say Fatima, because we have, without any titles, it was very expected. For example, in Egypt, in the first year, Dr. Mr. Morsi, for example, and there are estimations that $6 billion were spent to defame Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and not only Muslim Muhammad Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood, but against all the liberal and leftist revolutionary powers, and they were defamed hugely. So this is also, we cannot say that any lessons were learned in Tunisia from the Egyptian experience. Once again, I would like to repeat that the Islamic movements, they have a lot of financial resources, human resources and capabilities, a lot of practical experience in the political practice, but they have zero experience in media, zero experience. Most of the media that speak on behalf of the Islamic movements, and I agree completely with the descriptions that Fatima mentioned, that they were to the letter. I agree that some of the estimation or the evaluation that she mentioned, and I would like to reiterate here quickly: failure at a professional level, financial inability, the lack of vision, a lot of interventions by non-expert people, not understanding the rules of the game, and the lack of knowledge of the of the symbols and icons. And sometimes some icons, we have thousands of icons and symbols that can be used, but they were badly used. Or it is a winning card that was a strong hand that was used badly. The poor investment of human and financial resources. In Egypt, for example, the revolutionary powers had millions of dollars, but they were unable to produce genuine media support. The same applies to the revolutionary forces in Tunisia. They were depending that there was foreign that there were foreign media that can be supporting to that without knowing that this foreign media has agendas that is linked to the countries that are supporting or funding these media outlets. There is another point that is very important. In the civilian military relationships, the paper was very distinguished that is presented by Mr. Salah or Dr. Salah. We have a lesson in Egypt also. We always, Mr. Ahmed Qalul said at some points that there is a vision about the international aspects of the local or popular revolutions. I'm going to talk about that, but there is a tendency there was a boom in the writing about the military, civilian military relationships in the past 10 years. And we started to have a number of experts who are distinguished experts in this field, and we are not making use of their studies. And I can say, for example, Dr. Abdel Fattah Mati as a model or as an example of that. And he has a book that was published a couple of months ago, and there was a book from the conference that was made here about 2 years ago or 4 years ago. It talked about a number of experiences in this field, and a book was published accordingly. So when we say that there are no theorization or no writings about that, no, there are, but unfortunately, a lot of the political activists or those who are working in politics, they deal with what we write that this is only theorization, and they don't take it into consideration, and they don't give it any value. They say that you are not realistic. You don't know what is happening, and we can't take your word for it. No, we know everything about the relations, and we are very close to the reality, and we take into consideration all of these matters and international factors in that, because we are dealing with that every day and we are dealing with these issues. So building or bridging this gap between the theorizers, scholars, and the practitioners and the activists is one of the problems of the popular revolutions that wasn't made yet. The other point that Mr. Salah mentioned, which is the parallel security and using, for example, Qais Said for the impulsive resignation and the visiting, for example, the barracks and taking control over the Ministry of Interior and all of the military powers. All of these indicators were made in Egypt after 2013. So the coming aspect, the threatening aspect that, for example, 2 years ago until now, Qais Said was trying to take control over the interior, Minister of Interior and the military. The threatening aspect that started to happen a week ago, the absolute control over the judiciary in order to control or to issue rulings against all the revolutionary powers against him in the coming period. Today, Qais Said issued a decision or made a decision yesterday or today to prevent any strikes for all workers in the public sector. So now he has the judiciary, the military, the security, the media, and the squares, and the judiciary, the executive power, the legislative power, all under his control. So you cannot avoid him anymore after that. Thank you very much, Mr. Isam, for Dr. Isam, for this comment. We will have an opportunity for 2 other comments, and then we will go back to the speakers for final remarks. We will start here with Dr. Saleh. Thank you for the invitation. There are some points from what I heard from these papers. The second paper of Dr. Ahmed. I don't want to comment on the theoretical part, but I saw that the theoretical part affected his understanding of the revolution. So I feel that we need to focus on the idea of the history of revolutions, and he mentioned 10 phases. I believe that that was with the book of Phil Brilton that was written in 1936, which is Anatomy of a Revolution. After that, the book was written in a different way, and it was written by someone from Cambridge University. So the natural history of revolution has a problem by itself. When we compare between the revolutions and the problems that start to appear after the revolution. So I believe that that was reflected in his paper when he started to talk about the controversy about the revolutions and how the old regime and the new regime will meet at one point. And he mentioned Brimpton, as he mentioned in the book, and we talked about, for example, the era or the age of terrorism, or the revolutionary terrorism. And then he said that the revolution is a local factor. Even Brinkton didn't mention that. How can we say, for example, that the revolution is an internal factor? We are having an arc of a crisis that is going from the Arab Gulf to the to the Atlantic Ocean. So we can't not look at the international factor. In these days, for example, I didn't hear anything about the institutions of this movement, the ability of the movement to mobilize people, the structure, the organization of the movement, how the decision is made within the movement. I didn't hear anything about that. What I'm hearing here today is a number of decisions that were made, especially in the paper of Mr. Ahmed, that there were a number of decisions, simple decisions that led to the place we are in today. And some incidents, like, for example, the demonstration in the Bourguiba street, who made these decisions and how these decisions were made, and what is the relation of the ministry that was there with the movement, and how all of that was reflected in the overall understanding of the state. This is what happened, for example, Samuel Huntington about that. When we look at the action, we should not look at the political growth of the state, but in the third world, we need to look at the decomposition of the state. Look at what happens in Libya, for example. I didn't see in the paper, maybe only Mr. Salahuddin Jorashi, he just talked about the nature of the Tunisian institutions, and through which we can see the Ennahda movement in the natural context of in Tunisia. This is the topic of the entire symposium, which is governance and the relation of the movement with the governance. So this helps us understand the international factor and the local factor, and he makes the conflict a conflict of ideologies and a conflict of ideas. I believe this was missing in the papers. Thank you very much.
Dr. Muhammad, please go ahead.
شكرا جزيلا. هو
Thank you so much. I actually may have two quick questions. The first question, with regards to the ability of Qais Said to control military and security apparatuses. It's well known that usually the security and military apparatuses do not work in favor of the civilian. So they are independent of the other players. They take their own pace. But the question is, how had Qais Said conjured the power to take control of those institutions? And is it possible for this to be just an interim or provisional stage until he is disposed of by the military or the security? And the other question in relation to what you said about the Egyptian experience, it seems that Al-Nahda now is at the moment faced by the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013 in Egypt. So it's internally conflicted, no reliable ally. The state is very much against it. So the idea of thinking of alliances with other political actors within Tunisia, I believe that's not enough. And talking about international support or international mobilization, with whom? Who are the potential allies in regional and international arenas that have influence in the Tunisian arena with which Nahda can ally with? I don't believe the European Union, America, or even some regional powers may be relied upon. So I believe the idea of dissolving Nahda and sending its figures or leaders for trial is only a matter of time. For the time being, I can't see other perspectives or prospects. Sorry. Thank you so much for everyone. Now we will give the chance for our three speakers to respond in 4 minutes each, and then we will take a break before the fourth session. We will start with Ms. Fatima. You have 4 minutes now. Thank you, Doctor. Greetings to all, once again, I thank all the commentators, Mr. Isam and Mr. Safir. Actually, yes, if I had more time, I would have provided the intervention in a form of paper rather than a presentation. I agree with the commentators in what they said. Unfortunately, Islamic movements are non-innovative in their field, and allow me, without generalization, to say that we have a sort of ability to feel targeted without starting to resist, without creating a counter narrative, without trying to be professional about anything. Professionalism in anything is not given. It is acquired gradually by learning and by building your own experience and by expressing your identity. Each identity has its manifestation, its language, its popularity, its attraction, and we are not good at using those tools or marketing our identity or to put it in an ornamented frame, so to speak, or an attractive framework. Even if we do this, we do it by some other means that are not consistent with our own values, with our ideology, with our philosophy and identity itself. So each one of those movements, when they stumble sometimes and they stand sometimes and they keep going some other times, they fail in that regard. But accumulating those political lessons and learnings have to be used in order to start a new political approach in this age of communication in this age of social media and internet. Every political action is an act of communication. We cannot do politics without that. How could the coup d'etat take over the mindset, the public mindset? I remember that in March 2021, I warned that there was an attempt to clone the scenario in Egypt to Tunisia. There are scenarios that they are trying to copy. In Tunisia, we had arrests and some rap songs with certain popularity, talking about marginalization, poverty, lack of communication with those who govern. So the indicators were there, and they tried to use the same momentum and clone the same experience. The exacerbation of desperation and crisis within among the youth, and the problem of unemployment. Actually, there were slogans for the Tunisian revolution, which was employment, freedom, and national dignity. In employment, we went nowhere, and the Tunisian youth stand helpless as they watch a political elite that is distanced from itself, and a political struggle that from which they were away. And most of those young people have not seen tyranny, but in order to know that freedom, no matter how problematic, remains a gift, no matter how many disadvantages we have. So thank you so much for allowing me to respond or comment. Now I give the floor to Mr. Ahmed Qalul. Peace be upon you all. Only very quickly, the paper which I presented was to answer a specific question. It wasn't about a comprehensive study of revolutions, but it's concerned with the revolutions within the geopolitical context. Mr. Ahmed, can you open the camera, please? Excuse me.
أيوة السلام عليكم. قلت أن الورقة التي قدمتها
I said that the paper I presented was concerned with the geopolitical question, not a comprehensive study of revolutions, whether in terms of a Nahda movement or others. That's the point in question here. The other issue, I feel a bit self-conscious in dealing with what happened in Tunisia and in the Arab world as something I would only attribute to political Islam. It is a significant factor, but not the only essential factor, because political forces, be it nationalists, leftists, or even national movements after, or patriotic movements after the independence, went through similar stages. So it is important when we study those stages to look at the overall context rather than a very specialized or a smaller, narrow perspective. So we will be mistaken if we focus only on that dimension and ignoring the other aspects. And also, one of the problems of the political Islam is to look at the world as though they deal with us only as Islamists. Actually, the states use propaganda against you, but we know that we deal with the states and a set of regional and international interests that intersect, and many countries deal with the situation in Tunisia, at least, in very pragmatically, looking for the powers with whom and the players with whom they can work, not based on a preconception of political Islam. So it is important that we refrain from that categorization and to deal with this national situation as in its international dimension. Would the Al-Nahda, had Al-Nahda dealt differently in its relation with the administration and with the structures and institutions? Would the things have been different for it? I believe not. Within the context, the Al-Nahda moved backwards in many levels. Nonetheless, there were givens in Syria, Yemen, Libya, or elsewhere, and it would have been very hard for Tunisia to be away from that overall context. And even the stability of the situation now for Qais Said and his circles would be related to that international and regional context. As for the literature, I did mention that the review I offered was within my knowledge, not comprehensive, and unfortunately, despite the hard work of think tanks and study centers, they have not been able to create and author their own theories, and that's why I said that in the topic I have been studying, there were very few theorized standards and agreed standards. So this doesn't downplay the importance of academic work produced in Arabic. Actually, we have a duty to produce that ideational product, that theoretical product, and it is important for us to deal with politics from a theoretical perspective. Politicians, and this is one of the problems, politicians cannot practice policies and politics without a theoretical background and fundamentals. They would reinvent the wheel or use a trial and error approach. Thus, what I'm trying to say is that the academic work, which provides conclusions and findings based on field studies and social studies, would rationalize the work of Islamic movements, say, and unfortunately, this is not what they have done. The elite in political Islam and elsewhere is largely not based on that theoretical background and academic papers. So in the Arab world, there is a dire need for this kind of academic undertaking that we are having right now. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmad. The last comment by Mr. Salah Jorshi. Please go ahead. Thank you. I would like to thank all commentators. Your voice is too far away. No. Please go ahead. I will try to quickly respond to certain issues because the comments involved issues that would take too long. Your voice is too far.
تفضل استاذ صلاح.
لحظه بدي قلت الملاحظه الاولى.
I said that the first comment in relation to the Egyptian lesson, I want to.
He's inaudible, Dr. Simon.
Did you say Taimur?
His voice is too far. We cannot hear him.
يظهر انه المشكله عندك يا استاذ صلاح. اذا مش عارف هل انت قريب من ال.
انا قريب جدا من الكاميرا.
طيب لو ممكن يعني يكون صوتك اعلى قليلا.
طيب قلت بالنسبه للملاحظه المتعلقه بالدرس المصري.
In relation to the Egyptian lesson. Oh, we lost the voice altogether. Okay, now. Now we can hear you properly. Go ahead. So one of the major problems of Islamic movements is that they do not accumulate lessons and experiences. So each experience is isolated and is not studied and considered and evaluated in depth, but we do look at it without self-criticism, but with justification. So we try, we very often fall into the same pitfalls and the same mistakes. So there is a methodical problem or a problem with the way we think about things. However, nonetheless, I believe that the most important point learned from Egypt was not to escalate, to withdraw at the appropriate time, to avoid confrontation or clash, and to avoid mobilization of the public opinion against Al-Nahda. And I believe that what Al-Nahda did in 2014 when they withdrew from power and returned to power through elections, or tried to return to power through elections, was a better approach than to continue the confrontation or the clash. But to study the Egyptian experience in depth did not actually happen. Why? Because the Al-Nahda, like other movements, after the revolution started a dramatic process and a very detailed operation, day-to-day operation that did not give it the chance to distance itself and look from afar at things in Tunisia and to arrange for its accession to power in Tunisia, particularly to take the presidency, etc. Even when they took over governmental posts, they thought that they were in power, but that was the superficial form of power, but power in depth was the deep structure of the state, which was accumulated over dozens of years. So this was a premature assumption. Hence, Al-Nahda fell into those mistakes and didn't understand those lessons until it had those blows and started to justify itself and was on the defensive, and that lost its chance to be an active, proactive, and a positive actor in developing the situation in Tunisia. As for the West and its relation to freedoms, yes, of course, the West gives their own interests priority. However, there are opportunities for parties and for political movements that have to be seized. For example, Europe and America now are not in agreement with what the Qais Said is doing. So much of the internal movement should take into consideration the external dynamics, because those external dynamics would push the president to change his form of progression, because he would realize that if he continues in that way, it would cause an economic collapse and an earthquake, so to speak, to the institutions, and would render the state into a one-man show. So this Western role is important. If the political movement is smart, it should seize the day not to become a satellite or an extension of the West and to follow Western instruction, but to seize the opportunity for its own goals. And also, the other point, where does Qais Said conjure the power to control the security and the military? There is a set of factors that we need to analyze, but in my understanding, the capability started to develop over the past few years with the mistakes of the other political players, particularly Al-Nahda, which made the military and the security apparatus believe that there is a need for a personality, a new personality for presidency to centralize or unify the policies. But this relation, which is interest-based and informed by current circumstances, could change in the future. So Qais Said benefited from the populism, from the upheaval, from the failures before July 2019 or 2021, and this interest based alliance with the military and the security. So he furthers his agenda, but how far will that last? We will only, time can only tell. Thank you so much for listening and for inviting me to contribute to this session. Thank you so much for all the speakers, commentators, and participants. We thank you very much for this very valuable session. We will have a break right now until 3:30 Istanbul time. The next session is going to be in English, but we will have Arabic translation. The title of the next session is going to be Contemplations or Reflections on Al-Nahda Movement Experience, and we are going to have a number of speakers. Dr. Monica Marks from Abu Dhabi, Dr. William Lawrence from Washington, and Dr. Intisar from in Paris, and Dr. Tariq from Marmara University in Istanbul. See you soon.